She met him on a Tuesday, a stranger from Hinge who spoke like he'd been waiting for her his whole life. His name was Adrian Shaw, architect, attentive, the kind of man who made the world tilt back into focus. Coffee became dinners, dinners became weekends, and soon he was everywhere. In her messages, in her mornings, her thoughts, and her bed. For a while, it felt like love. The kind that makes you believe the universe finally got it right. Until little things began to change. A question here, a rule there. Compliments that sounded almost like commands. They said he was perfect. But perfection, Helen would learn, is often the first mask a monster wears. What started as affection began to feel like observation. And the more she fell for him, the less of herself she seemed to recognize. When friends stopped calling, one came back. Becca, the kind who asks the questions others are afraid to. And when Helen finally found the courage to listen, help came from unexpected places. A retired detective with a file too heavy for coincidence, and cops who arrived too late for peace, but just in time for truth. Before we go any further, comment where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. And don't miss the next story. Make sure you subscribe to Tailcraft. From the outside, Helen's life looked effortlessly enviable. She was in her late 20s. Independent, sarcastic in a way that made people laugh instead of wince, and quietly confident. A graphic designer who lived alone in a cozy apartment in the heart of New York City, surrounded by a chaos she had long learned to love. Outside her window, the city was loud and restless. Sirens, street chatter, the endless hum of life that never paused. But inside her apartment, there was calm. Soft golden light spilled across her oak desk, bookshelves lined the walls, and the air smelled faintly of jasmine and coffee. Potted plants stood like small green promises. This time, she swore she'd keep them alive. After years of heartbreaks, dead-end conversations, and mismatched expectations, Helen had made peace with her own company. She worked, cooked for one, watched documentaries late into the night, and laughed at her own jokes. She wasn't lonely, not anymore. She was fine, until Adrian happened. It began, like most stories of this age, with a swipe. A half-hearted evening scroll through Hinge meant more for distraction than destiny. Helen wasn't even looking. But then his profile appeared. Adrian Shaw, 32. His bio was simple, almost careless. Architect. Lover of art, quiet mornings, and people who mean what they say. Something about the phrasing caught her. No cliches. No bravado. Just sincerity. He looked grounded. Dark hair, intelligent eyes, and the kind of smile that didn't try too hard. They matched. And with that, a conversation began, easy, effortless, the kind that made time slip away. They joked about bad dating stories, talked about their favorite films, and debated the purpose of modern art. He was funny but not performative, thoughtful but not heavy. Every message felt like a conversation she'd been waiting to have. For the first time in a long while, Helen found herself checking her phone with anticipation. A week later, he asked to meet. "There's a gallery opening in Soho this Friday," he wrote. "Small crowd, pretentious art, great wine. You should come, if you promise to make fun of the exhibits with me." She laughed aloud at that. Against her usual instinct, she said yes. The gallery was one of those narrow, minimalist spaces tucked between brick buildings. A blur of white walls, soft jazz, and murmurs of conversation. Helen arrived late, half convinced she'd regret coming. Then she saw him. Adrian stood near a painting. Tall, well-dressed, with a stillness that drew the eye. He turned, and the room seemed to quiet around them. His eyes met hers. Steady, unreadable, and warm all at once. "You're Helen," he said with a smile that reached his eyes. "You look exactly like your pictures. Maybe even better." She smiled back, flustered. They walked together, pausing at each painting, exchanging dry commentary about the abstract strokes and cryptic titles. He wasn't like the others she'd met. No arrogance, no pretense. His presence was unhurried, confident without being loud. When he asked for her opinion on a piece, he listened, really listened, as if her thoughts mattered more than the artist's. Later, They stepped outside for air. The night was cool, the city alive with light. They stood at the corner, laughing about the gallery's absurd entry prices and the couple arguing over symbolism inside. And when the laughter faded, he looked at her and said quietly, "It's rare to meet someone who doesn't pretend. You're easy to be around." It wasn't a line. It didn't feel rehearsed. It just felt real. That night ended with coffee in a small 24-hour diner nearby. 2 hours of conversation turned into 4. They parted only when dawn began brushing the horizon. And by morning, she had a text waiting. "Had a great time. I'd like to see you again. Same place, less bad art." The days that followed moved in fast forward. Coffee the next morning became dinner the next night, then brunch that weekend. Within a week, he was texting her good morning and good night. Within 2, they were finishing each other's sentences. It should have felt too fast. Dizzying, reckless, but it didn't. It felt natural. Adrian remembered things. The way she liked her tea. The way she paused before speaking when she was thinking. That she'd once mentioned wanting to move to Barcelona because the whole city looks like it's made of daydreams. On their third date, he surprised her with a worn copy of her favorite childhood novel, A Wrinkle in Time. "You mentioned it once," he said, handing it to her with a grin. Everyone deserves a piece of nostalgia. It was perfect, thoughtful, almost uncanny. Her friends were surprised when they met him, maybe even skeptical. "You barely know him," Lucy had teased. "He's either a walking red flag or an actual miracle." Helen laughed it off. She didn't believe in miracles, but she couldn't deny how good it felt. To be seen, to be chosen, to be loved so attentively. Adrian was kind, generous, and attentive. He sent flowers to her office for no reason. Left handwritten notes in her purse. "You make ordinary days feel like home." He made her feel special, different. Within 2 months, he had a toothbrush at her apartment. Within 4, she found herself sleeping at his more often than her own. Everything about him felt safe, steady, like she'd finally found the person she'd been searching for all along. But love, Helen would later realize, rarely turns dark overnight. It shifts quietly, one shade at a time. It began with words that sounded sweet. One night, as she put on lipstick before dinner, Adrian smiled. "You don't need that," he said softly. "You're already beautiful." It sounded like affection, but something in his tone lingered. Not quite suggestion, not quite command. She let it go. Then came small questions. Who were you texting? Why are you working so late? Do you really have to grab drinks with that coworker? His words were wrapped in warmth. His concerns dressed as care. "I just worry about you," he'd say, touching her hand. Not everyone has good intentions. At first, she mistook it for love, for protectiveness. It wasn't. When she told him she felt things were moving too fast, he didn't get angry. He broke down. Tears in his eyes. He confessed he had abandonment issues, that everyone he'd cared about had left him. "You're different," he whispered. "If you ever walk away, I don't think I could take it." Her heart ached. So she stayed, because that's what love was. Understanding, compassion, staying even when things got hard, right? Within a span of 2 years, to the world, they looked perfect. To her friends on social media, they were the picture of stability, smiling at dinner tables, holding hands in photos, captioned with lines like, "Lucky to have found you." But behind the closed door of their shared life, cracks began to spread. Adrian was still charming in public, still affectionate when it mattered. But in private, he had changed. He'd begun to criticize her, subtly, surgically. "You sound childish when you laugh like that. You're too emotional. Why do you always have to make things dramatic?" He'd sigh when she tried to explain her feelings, then pull her into his arms and whisper, "I just want you to be your best self. You know I love you, right?" She stopped correcting him, stopped arguing, stopped reaching out to people who might notice the difference. Her hobbies faded, her friends drifted. Her reflection became unfamiliar, quieter, smaller, almost ghost-like. She told herself it was normal, that all relationships had rough patches. That love required sacrifice. But deep inside, beneath the noise of excuses, a quiet truth began to whisper. This isn't love. This is control. Helen ignored the voice. For months, she pushed it down. Until one ordinary afternoon, she found something that changed everything. She was looking for her charger in his desk drawer when her hand brushed against a photograph. It was a faded print. A young woman she didn't recognize, smiling beside Adrian. Her head rested on his shoulder, her hand on his chest. They looked happy, intimate. On the back, in looping handwriting, were 2 words. Forever. M. Her stomach nodded. The name. The intimacy. It didn't fit with the man who told her she was the only one who truly understood him. That night, she asked him about it. Casual tone. Steady voice. "Who's Marla?" Adrian didn't flinch. "Just an old friend," he said. "You're overthinking." Then he smiled. The same smile that once felt like sunlight but now felt like smoke. Helen forced herself to smile back, but the air around her felt thinner. Later that night, as Adrian slept beside her, she stared at the ceiling, and the whisper returned, louder this time. Something isn't right. She didn't know it yet, but that small photograph was the beginning of the end. The first fissure in the illusion she had mistaken for love. Because beneath Adrian's tenderness lived a darkness she couldn't yet see, one that had been waiting, patient and smiling, behind his smile. At first, it was subtle, small enough to excuse. A comment here, a sigh there. Moments that could be brushed off as stress, miscommunication, love's growing pains. But the pattern was clear. Adrian had a way of making Helen feel like she was always on trial, like she needed to prove her loyalty, her goodness, her worth. One moment he'd be affectionate, warm, funny. The next, his eyes would cloud over. Distant, cold, and she'd find herself replaying every word she'd said, searching for what she'd done wrong. When she asked what was bothering him, he'd say things like, "Nothing. You're just being sensitive." Or worse, "Why do you always make everything about you?" At first, Helen fought back. Then she tried to reason with him. Then she cried. And eventually, she stopped reacting at all. Because when every disagreement ends with you being the problem, silence becomes survival. Adrian's behavior came in waves, highs so dizzying they made the lows feel like her fault. It was a pattern Helen didn't yet have a name for. First came the love, overwhelming, intoxicating. He'd drown her in affection until she felt like she was the center of his world. Then came the control, gentle corrections that became rules. And finally, the guilt, how he always found a way to twist the story until she was the one who needed to apologize. When she pulled away, he'd chase. When she stayed, he'd withdraw. She once tried to leave, packed a small overnight bag, and walked out after a brutal argument about nothing that somehow ended with him calling her selfish. But by morning, he was at her door, tear-streaked, trembling, holding a letter written in his elegant handwriting. "You're the only one who's ever seen me for who I am," he'd said. "I'll get help. I'll do therapy. I just can't lose you." And just like that, her resolve broke. Because his vulnerability felt real. Because she remembered the man who made her laugh, who brought her tea in bed, who told her she was his home. She believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she was human. The weeks that followed were quiet, calm, too calm. Adrian acted softer, kinder, at first. He apologized more, surprised her with flowers again. But the air between them had changed. The tension was invisible but thick, like humidity before a storm. Helen began to notice little things. His possessiveness disguised as affection. His need to know where she was at all times. He'd text her, "Miss you." Then again an hour later, "Where are you?" If she didn't respond fast enough, he'd say, "Just worried." The subtext wasn't lost on her. Every move she made felt observed, weighed, and quietly judged. She started walking on eggshells, laughed softer, spoke slower, measured every word like stepping stones across a river she might drown in. On social media, she still posted pictures, him kissing her forehead, her smiling against his shoulder. But in real life, she was vanishing. Her friends stopped inviting her out. Not because they didn't care, but because she always said no. And when Lucy asked once, "Are you sure you're okay?" Adrian was right there beside her, smiling, squeezing her hand. "Of course she's okay," he said lightly. "She's happier than she's ever been." Helen smiled too. because what else could she do? Afterward, he told her Lucy was jealous. She doesn't understand what we have. People hate seeing something real. And Helen, who used to trust her instincts, began to trust his instead. It was around this time that the fear began. Not fear of him, not yet. Fear of losing him. He had built their love like a fortress, one brick of dependency at a time. When she felt anxious, he comforted her. When she felt confident, he cut her down, just enough to make her need his validation again. He told her he was all she needed. And slowly, she began to believe him. She worked less, stopped seeing friends. Her world shrank until it revolved entirely around Adrian's moods. Whether the day was good or bad depended on how he greeted her in the morning. One evening, after a long silence, he looked at her and said, "You've changed. You're not as fun as you used to be." She wanted to scream, "You did this to me." But instead, she smiled weakly and said she'd try harder. The first real fracture came from a stranger. One night, Adrian was in the shower. Helen was scrolling through her phone when a message popped up from an unknown number. The name read Sasha. The text was short. "If you are with Adrian, please be careful. He's not who you think he is." Her stomach twisted. She stared at the screen, waiting for the punchline. It had to be a prank. Some jealous ex. Maybe spam. She didn't reply, but the words burrowed under her skin like splinters. After Adrian fell asleep that night, she searched the name online. Sasha plus Adrian plus New York. Nothing useful. A few dead ends, some deleted accounts. Still, something about the tone haunted her. The message hadn't sounded angry or jealous. It had sounded terrified. The next day, the text was gone, deleted, not by her. When she asked Adrian if he'd seen anything strange on her phone, he just smiled. "You really should use a better passcode," he said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Anyone could get into your messages." Her heart went still. He kissed her forehead, and she didn't sleep that night. After that, something in Helen shifted. She stopped believing the story she'd built around him, the one where he was broken but good, damaged but kind. Her world began to tilt, and she started noticing all the details she'd ignored before. The way he never talked about his family, the vague stories about his past, the friends she'd never met. Every answer he gave her felt too neat, too rehearsed. So she began to search. At first, quietly. She went through old photos, emails, and receipts. When he left for work, she'd combed through drawers, cabinets, pockets. Every discovery led to another question. It became an obsession, her secret rebellion. She looked for clues the way a drowning person looks for air. One night, she found something. Not much, just an old envelope tucked in a box of paperwork. Inside was a photo of Adrian with another woman. The same one from the message. Sasha. The woman's face was half turned, laughing. Adrian's arm around her looked possessive. On the back of the photo, scrawled in blue ink, "New beginnings to 2018. Helen's pulse roared in her ears. She went online again, searching the name. This time she added the city. She found an article, barely a paragraph long. Local woman Sasha Collins reported missing after a weekend trip with her boyfriend. Police say there are no suspects at this time. No updates. No closure. Just gone. Helen sat frozen. The date, 2018, matched the photo. When Adrian came home that night, she pretended to be asleep. In the following weeks, paranoia consumed her. She dug deeper. Online archives, old forums, even obscure subreddits about missing people. And what she found made her blood run cold. Stories, threads, different names, same pattern. A charming man, intense romance, sudden control, then silence. Each post described someone who sounded like Adrian, sometimes Adam, sometimes Andrew, sometimes just A. Most posts were deleted. The few that remained were full of warning. One message in particular stood out. "If his name is Adrian, run." I thought I could change him. I was wrong. Helen couldn't breathe. The walls of their apartment felt smaller, closer. Her entire world, every memory, every moment, rearranged itself into something darker. The man she loved wasn't who she thought. He wasn't broken. He was dangerous. That night, Adrian held her while she lay stiff in his arms, pretending to drift to sleep. He whispered, "I love you, you know that?" And she said it back, though her throat burned with fear. The whisper in her head, the one she'd silenced for so long, was now screaming. This isn't love. This is survival. She stared into the darkness, her pulse loud in her ears, realizing that she wasn't lying beside the man she loved anymore. She was lying beside a man she might need to escape from. He wasn't just manipulative. He was dangerous. And if his stories were true, he had done this before. Helen knew better than to confront him outright. Adrian was too calculated, too skilled at turning truth into illusion. If she accused him now, he'd twist it until she was the paranoid one. He always did. So she acted. She smiled when he spoke, laughed at his jokes, kissed him goodnight like nothing had changed. But underneath the calm surface, every muscle in her body was coiled tight. Every morning, she rehearsed her expressions in the mirror, learning how to look relaxed, how to disguise terror as love. Each gesture had to be perfect. One wrong word could make him suspicious. Every spare moment became part of a quiet, methodical mission. She bought a burner phone under a fake name, created an anonymous email address, cleared her browser history daily, and she began to dig. It started with a photo box she found in their attic. Adrian had told her once it was old college stuff, dusty memories he never bothered to throw away. But when she finally opened it, her breath caught. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, each of different women, none of them labeled, but all intimate in some way. Smiling beside Adrian, sitting close at cafes. One woman had her hand on his cheek. Another wore his jacket. One photo stopped her cold. A girl with auburn hair and a sunflower tattoo on her wrist. Helen recognized that tattoo. Adrian had one just like it on his back. He once told her it was for his sister who died young. But in the photo, the girl's fingers curled around his. Her head rested on his shoulder. Not a sister, a lover. On the back of the photo, a faint name, Marla. Her hand trembled as she typed the name into her search bar. Nothing at first. Then a tiny news article from 2019. Local woman Marla Jensen reported missing after weekend trip with boyfriend. No leads. Helen stared at the headline, her vision tunneling. Marla, the same Ming. The same year Adrian claimed he moved away for work. There were no updates, no body, no closure. Just gone. That night, Helen didn't sleep. She started writing. A list of names, dates, clues. Marla Jensen, missing. 2019. Sasha Collins, missing 2021. The woman who texted her. Danielle Morris, online post. Boyfriend named Adam, suddenly vanished. Adam. Adrian. The same pattern. Each story began with love, intense, consuming, fairy tale perfect. Then came isolation, control, silence, and finally, disappearance. The deeper she looked, the clearer the pattern became. Different names, same charm, different cities, same story. Helen knew she couldn't go to the police yet, not with scraps of screenshots and half-deleted threads. She needed help, someone who would believe her before it was too late. So she reached out to Becca Grant, her old college roommate. They hadn't spoken in over a year. Adrian had made sure of that. He'd called Becca toxic, jealous, said she fed on drama. Helen had believed him then. Now she saw the manipulation for what it was. She texted Becca from the burner phone. "I need to talk. It's serious. Please." Becca responded within minutes. "Are you safe?" They met the next afternoon at a quiet cafe uptown. Helen arrived early, hood pulled over her face, hand shaking. When Becca walked in, her expression shifted from confusion to alarm. Helen looked pale, thinner, her eyes hollowed from sleepless nights. "What's going on?" Becca whispered. Helen slid a folder across the table, printouts of missing person articles, photos, message threads, her own timeline written in frantic ink. Becca flipped through them silently. After a long pause, she looked up. "You know you have enough for an investigation, right? This isn't just abuse. This is predatory." Helen nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I think he's killed them." Becca didn't doubt her. That, more than anything, made Helen start to cry. Back at the apartment, Helen did everything she could to appear normal. She cooked dinner, laughed at his stories, wore the same perfume, but Adrian was perceptive, eerily so. He began to notice the subtle changes, her distracted tone, her late nights, the way she flinched when he touched her. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening, tracing a finger down her arm. "Is something wrong?" "Just tired," she smiled, heart pounding. He nodded slowly, studying her face for too long, then smiled that soft, practiced smile that had once made her knees weak. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" Of course. But Helen could feel it, the way his gaze lingered too long, as if measuring what she was hiding. Every word, every breath felt like walking across a frozen lake. One wrong step, and everything would crack. She met Becca twice more in secret. Becca had brought in a contact. Michael Hawley, a retired detective who now worked freelance investigations. He listened quietly as Helen described everything, jotting down notes without interrupting. When she finished, he said simply, "If even half of what you're saying checks out, this man's dangerous. You need to stay somewhere safe." But Helen wasn't ready to run. Not yet. She wanted proof, something undeniable that would tie Adrian to the disappearances. Michael agreed to help. He'd start digging background checks, property records, financial trails. In the meantime, Helen was to stay calm, invisible, predictable. It sounded simple. It wasn't. Every day with Adrian felt like a performance she was barely holding together. One evening, after meeting Becca downtown, Helen took a longer route home to clear her head. The streets were nearly empty, the air heavy with mist. When she turned onto her block, her chest tightened. Adrian's car was parked halfway down the street. Engine off, headlights dimmed. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. She slowed her steps, scanning the shadows. That's when she saw him, standing in the alley beside her building, hands in his coat pockets, watching. Not waiting, watching. Her breath hitched. She turned back the way she came, forcing herself not to run. She didn't go home that night. Instead, she took a cab to a cheap roadside motel, paid in cash, and kept the lights on until sunrise. By morning, her phone was full of missed calls. 16 from Adrian, 3 voicemails. The first was calm. "Hey, babe, just worried. Call me." The second sounded colder. "Where are you? You're scaring me." The third, "You think I don't know?" She threw the phone against the wall, trembling. He knew. She didn't know how much or how, but she could feel it in her bones. The way he'd been looking at her lately, like someone evaluating a chessboard, planning his next move. She wasn't his girlfriend anymore. She was a liability. Her mind replayed every story she'd read online. Every woman who thought she could fix him. Everyone who vanished trying. She couldn't be next. She wouldn't be next. A week later, Becca texted her. "Michael found something. We need to meet." They met in a public park, daylight spilling through the trees. Michael handed her a folder. Inside was a property record. A cabin 2 hours north of the city, registered under a false name, but connected to Adrian through an untraceable trust. Satellite images showed his car there, repeatedly, over several years. The missing women? All had last been seen within miles of that route. Helen's blood ran cold. She realized then that this wasn't just a theory. It was a map of his crimes. "We're going to the police," Becca said firmly. "We'll take this through proper channels." Helen nodded, but a part of her already knew. Adrian wouldn't let her live long enough to testify. Adrian knew everything, and the next move would be his. Helen never went back to the apartment. She still had the keys. Her name was still on the lease. Half her life, clothes, books, old sketch pads, framed photos of a woman she barely recognized anymore, sat folded inside those rooms. But something in her gut told her that if she crossed that threshold again, she might not walk out. So she vanished. Not completely. She still existed on paper, still had a job, an ID, a past. But in the places that mattered to Adrian, in the spaces he could predict, she disappeared. The first place she stayed was a cheap hotel near the airport, the kind of place nobody remembered staying in. The wallpaper peeled in the corners. The air smelled faintly of cigarettes and cleaner. The clerk barely looked at her when she paid in cash. Helen checked in under a name that wasn't hers, one she'd practiced saying in the mirror until it didn't sound strange. She slept with the lights on and the chair shoved under the doorknob, her packed bag aligned by the bed like a safety line. Every sound made her flinch, the rumble of ice in the vending machine downstairs, footsteps in the hallway, the metallic groan of plumbing in the walls. For the first time since she met Adrian, there was physical distance between them, but the feeling of him hadn't left. He was still there, in the way she glanced over her shoulder, in the way her hand shook when she checked her phone. Her burner device stayed powered off unless she needed to text Becca or Michael. Her real phone, the one Adrian knew, remained buried deep inside her bag, switched off like a dead organ. Over the next week, she moved between short-term rentals arranged under fake names, small furnished rooms rented in cash, 1 or 2 nights at a time. Never enough to be traceable. Never enough to feel safe. Every new room had the same ritual. Blinds closed, doors checked twice, exits identified. She slept in her clothes. She ate standing up, too on edge to sit long. On the outside, it looked like paranoia. On the inside, it was math. If Adrian could find the women before her, he could find her too. While Helen hid in spare rooms and anonymous beds, Becca and Michael moved in the opposite direction, straight toward the danger. Becca was relentless. Years of freelance journalism had taught her how to follow threads others ignored. She spent hours digging into missing person cases, building timelines, contacting families who were still stuck in limbo. Michael worked his old contacts quietly. He'd once been a homicide detective, methodical, unshackable, the kind of man who'd seen enough that very little surprised him anymore. But this did. The more they looked into Adrian Shaw, the less he existed. His digital footprint was neat, almost too clean. Officially, he was ordinary. An architect, decent income, no priors, no flagged reports. But off the record, there were gaps. Entire months with no traceable activity. Sudden job changes. Rental records that didn't line up with his claimed addresses. The cabin properties were the breakthrough. One of them had been registered through a shell trust. On paper, it belonged to a corporate entity tied to a distant relative. In reality, satellite images showed Adrian's car in the driveway, again and again, across several years. The last known sightings of several missing women overlapped eerily with the route leading past that cabin. This isn't coincidence, Michael told Becca grimly, spreading photos across the table. This is a pattern. They compiled everything. Photos, screenshots, phone records, property filings, and took it to authorities willing to listen. It wasn't easy. Missing women with no bodies weren't the priority they should have been. But the connections were too strong to dismiss. Eventually, the right people listened. A search warrant for the cabin was drafted. Somewhere in an office, a judge read through their evidence and hesitated over the weight of a signature. It was progress. But progress moved slower than danger. The distance didn't make Helen feel safer. It only gave her more room to think, and that was its own kind of torture. She started documenting everything she remembered, not as a girlfriend nursing heartbreak, but as a witness preparing to testify. In cheap notebooks bought from corner stores, she wrote down every moment that now felt wrong in hindsight. The way Adrian's eyes would turn flat whenever she mentioned leaving. The way he referred to his exes as crazy, unstable, obsessed. The way he once said, almost casually, "It's amazing what people are willing to overlook if you make them feel special first." She wrote about his patterns, how he love-bombed, isolated, then chipped away at her confidence until she believed she couldn't live without him. The more she wrote, the more something inside her began to shift. She stopped feeling like a victim stumbling through a nightmare. She started feeling like someone waking up from one. Her hand trembled at times, but the words kept coming. With every line, she was reclaiming something he'd taken from her. Her voice, her perception, her reality. She wrote through the fear. She wrote until the pages stopped feeling like confessions and started feeling like evidence. The first time Adrian called, the sound of his name on the screen almost made her drop the phone. Blocked number. No caller ID, but she knew. She stared at the device for a long time before answering, hand shaking so hard she had to steady it on the table. She didn't speak. Neither did he, at first. She could hear him breathing, controlled, calm. Then, finally, "You're scared," he said softly. "I get it." She hung up. The next night, there was another call. Then another. Sometimes he spoke. Sometimes he didn't. One voicemail arrived at 2:13 a.m. His voice was gentle, almost amused. "You know, you're not easy to lose, Helen. I can still feel you. You think distance changes that?" Another, left the following night, was colder. "You really think they'll believe you over me?" And then, one message that made her blood freeze. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" She stopped listening after that, but she didn't delete them. Not anymore. Everything now was potential evidence. Days blurred. There was talk of the search warrant coming through soon. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe a few more days. Maybe longer. Helen learned something terrible about justice. Sometimes it moved at a pace that people in danger couldn't afford. Becca sent updates when she could. "The judge has the file. Michael says it looks solid. Just hang on a little longer." Helen read the messages in rooms that didn't belong to her, staring out of windows that framed unfamiliar streets. She tried to eat, tried to sleep, but the feeling of being hunted seeped into everything. She felt like she was living inside someone else's countdown. And then, suddenly, the calls stopped. No messages. No blocked numbers. No emails. Silence. Helen didn't trust it. She checked the news. Searched his name. Nothing. No arrest. No accident. No obvious reason he'd go quiet. The silence felt worse than the calls. 2 days later, at 1:34 a.m., her burner phone buzzed with a message from Becca. He knows. He's running. His apartment's empty. He quit his job. Michael can't trace his cards. We're trying to track him, but you need to get somewhere safe. Somewhere he can't guess. The room seemed to tilt. Helen sat down slowly, the phone still in her hand. He was gone. Not in the way she needed him to be. Behind bars, contained, over. He was gone in a way that meant he was moving, planning, adjusting. And when someone like Adrian went quiet, it wasn't because he'd given up. It was because he'd decided on his next move. Helen didn't wait. She packed in under 10 minutes. Passport, cash, burner phone, the journal and flash drive with all her notes. One change of clothes, her warmest coat, and nothing she couldn't afford to lose. There was one place he didn't know about. At least, she hoped he didn't. An old family cabin her father had left behind years ago. She hadn't been there in a decade. It wasn't in her current address records, and she'd never mentioned it to Adrian. Not once. It was a place tied to a version of herself he'd never met. The teenage Helen, who used to curl up with books on the porch and listen to the wind move through the trees. It was remote. No Wi-Fi. Barely any cell reception. For the first time, those things felt like safety. She rented a car under yet another false name and drove through the night, fingers locked at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The city lights fell away behind her, replaced by long dark stretches of road. Every set of headlights in her rearview mirror made her heart race. She rehearsed what she would do if she saw his car. If he blocked the road, if he forced her to stop, she kept driving anyway. Just before sunrise, as the sky turned from black to washed-out gray, she turned onto the unmarked road that led toward the cabin. Trees closed around her on both sides, tall and dense, the world narrowing to a single gravel path. Her phone signal dropped to nothing. The dashboard clock glowed the only steady light. That's when she saw it. In the rearview mirror, appearing over a rise in the road, a black SUV. No headlights. No visible license plate. Just a dark shape sliding into view behind her. Her chest compressed. She pressed harder on the gas, the tires crunching against gravel. The SUV followed. Not too close. Not too far. Every horror scenario flashed in her mind. Being rammed off the road, dragged from the car, disappearing into the trees like the women in the articles she couldn't stop reading. Don't panic, she whispered to herself, though every cell in her body was already doing exactly that. She veered down the overgrown path that led directly to the cabin. Branches scraped along the sides of the car. the road narrowing, leaves slapping the windshield. She risked a glance in the mirror. The SUV had stopped at the mouth of the path. It idled there for a second, a dark, silent shape in the dawning light. Then it slowly reversed and disappeared. Helen didn't know if that made it better or worse. When she finally reached the cabin, her hands were shaking so hard she barely got the keys into the lock. The air inside smelled like dust and old wood. It was untouched, exactly as she'd remembered, just older. Her father's faded armchair still sat near the window. The kitchen was small, stocked with long expired cans and a kettle that had seen better years. She checked every room, every closet, every corner. No one was there. She was alone. It should have been comforting. It wasn't. She barricaded the front door with a small table and a heavy chair, found an old fire poker by the stone fireplace and gripped it like a lifeline. Then she sat by the window, the same one she'd once leaned against as a teenager, watching summer storms and listening to thunder. Now, each rustle of leaves outside sounded like footsteps. Each creak of wood was a breath on her neck. She clutched the journal in one hand and the iron poker in the other, eyes fixed on the tree line. She didn't know if Adrian had been in that SUV, if he knew this place existed, if he was already in the woods, watching the cabin the way he'd once watched her. All she knew was that she had two fragile things left: time, and the hope that someone would find him before he found her. So she waited, not as a girlfriend hoping he'd come home, but as a survivor bracing for the moment he did. The forest around the cabin was too quiet. Silence, Helen realized, isn't the absence of sound. It's the sound of everything waiting. Each gust of wind through the pines made the cabin creak like an old ship, and every creak made her pulse jump. She hadn't slept in 2 days. The rain that had started before dawn hadn't stopped. It came in sheets, drumming on the tin roof like impatient fingers. She sat by the window, clutching the fire poker she'd found by the hearth. Outside, the trees blurred in the downpour. Inside, her reflection in the glass looked like a ghost pale, hollow-eyed, unblinking. She kept telling herself she was safe here. But safety, she'd learned, was just another illusion Adrian was good at selling. By nightfall, the storm deepened. The power flickered twice before dying completely, plunging the cabin into a darkness that felt thick enough to touch. Helen lit a candle. Its small, trembling flame threw the room into sharp relief, furniture looming like shadows of things that once had meaning. The smell of melting wax mingled with damp air. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and tried to breathe, slow and steady. Every instinct screamed that he was near, but there was no proof. Only silence, heavy and electric, until she heard it. A creak, then another. The front porch. Her breath caught. The steps were deliberate, slow, measured, like someone making noise on purpose. She gripped the poker tighter, her heart thundering in her ears. And then came the knock. Not a pounding demand. A soft, polite tap, 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 like a neighbor asking to borrow sugar. Then a voice. "Helen, open the door. I just want to talk, Adrian." His tone was calm, coaxing, threaded with that same deceptive warmth he used to disarm her years ago. "You're scared. I understand that," he said softly through the wood. "But it doesn't have to end like this." Rain hissed on the roof. The candle flickered. Helen stayed still, not daring to breathe. "I read your journal," he continued. "You think you know me? You don't. You only know the parts I wanted you to see." Her stomach turned. He'd been here. He'd touched her things. "Those women you wrote about," he went on, voice lowering. "They weren't victims. They betrayed me. They lied. They tried to hurt me. But you're different, Helen. You're loyal. You stayed." Tears blurred her vision, half rage, half terror. Even now, he was twisting the narrative, recasting himself as the wounded one. "Please," she whispered under her breath, though she didn't know if it was a prayer or a plea to herself. "Go away." But then, silence. No footsteps. No voice. She waited a full minute before inching toward the window. The rain had eased just enough for her to see the porch. Empty. Her shoulders sagged with trembling relief. She turned toward the back door and froze. He was inside, dripping wet, calm, standing in the doorway to the kitchen, rainwater pooling beneath his boots. A soft, satisfied smile curved his lips. "I always knew you'd come here," he said quietly. "This is where people go when they want to feel safe. Isn't that what we always wanted, Helen? Safety. You and me against the world." She backed up slowly, the poker raised. "Don't," she said. He stepped closer, hands lifted in mock surrender. "You wrote some really hurtful things," he murmured. "But I forgive you. You were scared. They put ideas in your head, Becca, that detective. They don't know you like I do." Her chest tightened. He was still trying to perform, to wear the mask of the man she'd once loved. "You need help, Adrian," she managed. Her voice shook but didn't break. "You hurt people." For a heartbeat, he was still. Then the smile fell away. What replaced it was worse, cold, hollow, unmasked. "You were never going to be loyal," he said flatly. "None of you ever are." Something in his voice made her understand what those other women must have heard right before the end. He lunged. She swung. The iron poker slammed into his shoulder with a sickening thud. He staggered, knocking over a chair, then caught himself, eyes blazing. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed. Helen bolted. Through the front door, into the storm, barefoot and breathless. Branches clawed at her arms as she ran, mud sucking at her feet. The cold rain stung her skin, but she didn't stop. Behind her footsteps, closer, louder, his voice cutting through the downpour. "Helen!" She pushed harder, lungs burning, heart screaming in her chest. Ahead, through the trees, a faint glow headlights. For a second, she thought she was imagining it. Then she heard sirens. 2 police cars burst through the tree line, tires sliding on wet earth. Officers spilled out, flashlights slicing the darkness. "Helen Marlowe, stay where you are." She stumbled toward the lights, collapsing into the mud, sobbing. Behind her, Adrian emerged from the woods like a shadow-soaked, furious, unrecognizable. "She's lying," he shouted, voice ragged. "You don't understand." But he didn't get far. Within seconds, officers tackled him to the ground. The night filled with shouting, rain, and the metallic click of handcuffs. Helen fell to her knees, gasping, watching as they dragged him away. Adrian turned once, meeting her eyes, and for the first time, the smile was gone. Only emptiness remained. 3 months later, the world called it a miracle. Adrian Shaw was in custody, awaiting trial on multiple charges: kidnapping, assault, attempted murder, and suspected involvement in at least 3 disappearances. Forensic teams had uncovered evidence from the hidden cabin: jewelry, phones, a watch engraved with initials that matched one of the missing women. News outlets ran his story for weeks. "The architect of affection," one headline read. Another: "Charming predator arrested after survivor's escape." Helen didn't read them. She didn't want to be a headline, or a cautionary tale, or a survivor the world pitied. She just wanted her life back. Healing wasn't instant. It wasn't cinematic. There were nights she woke up screaming. Days she couldn't leave her new apartment. Moments when a knock at the door made her heart hammer like she was still in that cabin. Becca visited often. So did Michael. They never pushed. They just sat with her. Let silence be enough. The police returned her journal, now sealed in an evidence bag. She couldn't bring herself to open it for weeks. When she finally did, she found one page she didn't remember writing. Just a sentence scrolled at the bottom. The mask slipped, and I lived. She closed it gently and smiled through the tears. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed press. Victims' families, strangers hungry for closure. Helen chose not to attend. She'd already testified once, behind closed doors. She didn't need to see his face again. Becca went instead, sending updates afterward. He looked small. She texted. Like the performance finally ended, and he didn't know who to be without it. It took the jury less than a day. Guilt time. All counts. Adrian Shaw would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for Helen, freedom wasn't about his imprisonment. It was about her own. Months later, she moved to a new city, one that didn't carry echoes of her old life. Different skyline, different rhythm. She chose it not because it was beautiful, but because no one there knew her story. She cut her hair shorter, started freelancing again, bought secondhand furniture. Learned the simple piece of making morning coffee without looking over her shoulder. The first week, she barely left the apartment. The second, she began walking short distances, a few blocks, then a few more. By the third, she was sitting on park benches again, sketchbook in hand, remembering what it felt like to create without fear. Her therapist told her recovery wasn't about erasing the past. It was about giving it context, learning to live alongside it instead of beneath it. And for the first time, that made sense. She didn't hate the memories anymore. She hated what they cost her, the woman she'd been before him, the laughter that came easy. But she also understood something vital. She hadn't lost that woman entirely. She'd just buried her under survival. And now, she was digging her back out. Some nights were still hard. A knock at the door could freeze her mid-step. A certain cologne in a crowd could send her spiraling back to the smell of rain and fear. But each time she reminded herself, this is now. He can't touch you here. The nightmares came less often. And when they did, she didn't wake up screaming anymore. She woke up breathing. A small victory, but a victory all the same. It was Becca who convinced her to share her story. Not publicly, not online, but with other women who needed to hear it. So Helen started volunteering at a support group for survivors of emotional and psychological abuse. At first, she just listened, faces around the circle, each one carrying their own version of silence. Then, one evening, someone asked her how she knew when it was time to leave. She hesitated, then said softly, "When I realized love shouldn't make me afraid to breathe." The room was silent for a long moment. Then someone else nodded, then another. And in that quiet, Helen felt something uncoil inside her, the power of truth unhidden. Seasons changed. Spring brought sunlight through new curtains, warm and unfamiliar. Summer carried laughter from open windows, strangers' voices, no longer a threat. Autumn came with long walks and the crunch of leaves underfoot, the kind of sound she used to associate with running. Now, it was simply beautiful. She stopped checking news about Adrian after a while. The knowledge of his sentence, life without parole, was enough. She didn't need to hear his name again to know he was over. Her story wasn't about him anymore. It was about what survived in spite of him. One evening, near sunset, Helen found herself sitting on a park bench. Sketchbook open, pencil gliding over the paper. It wasn't the same bench where her story began, but it felt like it could have been. The city buzzed softly in the distance. Children laughed near the fountain. For once, the world didn't feel like something happening to her. It felt like something she was part of again. She reached into her bag and pulled out her old journal, the one with the faded cover, edges frayed from years of trembling hands. On the last page, beneath the words she'd written months ago, the mask slipped. And I lived. She added one final line. Healing isn't forgetting what happened. It's learning that it doesn't define you anymore. Sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't about the monsters we escape, but about the people we become afterward. Helen learned that real love doesn't shrink you. It expands you. It doesn't trap you in fear. It frees you in truth. To anyone listening who's ever doubted their worth, who's ever mistaken control for care or silence for peace, this story is for you. You're not broken. You're not weak. You survived. And one day, like Helen, you'll find that quiet rebuild waiting for you too.